We've set up a small donation box near the entrance for anyone who might need help covering expenses, my daughter-in-law said softly, her hand brushing my arm as if she were offering comfort. But her eyes told a different story, cool and measuring, as though she had already decided exactly who I was. I nodded, just once, and walked past her into the chapel where my husband's funeral was already underway. The scent of lilies thick in the air, too sweet, almost suffocating. The room looked exactly how Richard would have wanted it. Polished wood, soft lighting, a quiet kind of dignity. But something in it felt off, like a picture hung slightly crooked. I noticed it in the way conversations dipped when I passed, in the way people smiled at me with pity instead of respect, in the way no one asked me anything about the arrangements, even though I had spent 42 years beside the man they were all here to mourn. I took my seat and realized, after a second, that it wasn't in the front row where a wife would normally sit, but 2 rows back, slightly to the side, as if I were a distant relative rather than the woman who had shared his bed, his table, his life. I didn't say anything. I simply smoothed the fabric of my black dress over my knees and folded my hands in my lap, the way my mother had taught me when silence was the only way to keep your dignity intact. Vanessa moved gracefully through the room, greeting guests, directing the staff, accepting condolences as though she were the one who had lost a husband instead of me. She wore a tailored black dress, tasteful, expensive, the kind of thing you choose when you know people are watching. Every detail was perfect. Every detail was hers. I watched as she leaned in close to a group near the aisle, her voice low but not low enough. "We're keeping things simple," she said, a soft laugh following the words. Given the circumstances, it just made sense. One of the women glanced at me, then quickly looked away, her lips pressing together in something that might have been sympathy or embarrassment. I couldn't tell anymore. Daniel stood near the casket, his shoulders squared, his expression composed, the way he used to look before a big presentation when he was younger. Back when he still came to me for advice. He didn't look at me now. Not once. When our eyes almost met, he turned, just slightly, as if something more important had caught his attention. I recognized that movement. Avoidance has a very particular shape. The minister began speaking, his voice steady, practiced, filling the room with words about legacy and kindness and a life well lived. I listened, but not really. My attention drifted instead to the small details that didn't belong. The envelope placed discreetly near the guest book, the way Vanessa gently guided people toward it, the quiet murmurs that followed. "It's thoughtful," someone whispered behind me. "Given her situation." Her situation. I repeated the words in my mind, turning them over slowly, like a coin I didn't recognize. I wondered when exactly my life had been reduced to something people could summarize in 2 words and a lowered voice. I thought about the house, about the years Richard and I had spent restoring it piece by piece, about the long evenings at the kitchen table with receipts spread out between us, planning, building, believing we were creating something that would outlast us both. I thought about the promises he made, not grand ones, not dramatic, but quiet assurances spoken in the dark when the world felt far away and it was just the 2 of us. "You'll be taken care of," he had said once, his hand resting over mine. No matter what. I had believed him. I still did. The service continued, voices rising and falling, memories shared, laughter breaking through the grief in small, careful doses. People stood to speak about him, about his generosity, his intelligence, his ability to make anyone feel seen. I noticed, though, that no one mentioned me. Not once. It was as if I had been edited out of the story entirely, like a chapter that no longer fit the narrative they preferred. Vanessa caught my eye briefly then, offering a smile that didn't quite reach hers, a smile meant for display rather than connection. She tilted her head slightly, a gesture that might have looked kind to anyone else. To me, it felt like confirmation. They had already decided who I was without him, and it wasn't someone worth listening to. I lowered my gaze, letting the silence settle around me again, familiar now, almost comfortable. I had spent a lifetime learning how to sit inside it without breaking. Around me, the service moved toward its close, people shifting in their seats, preparing for the final words, the final goodbye. I remained still, my hands folded, my expression calm, exactly as they expected. Because the truth was, I understood something they didn't. I understood that being underestimated is a kind of freedom. and I had just been given more of it than I'd ever had before. I did not cry when the last guest left the chapel. I stood near the doorway instead, watching as people gathered their coats and lowered their voices, their expressions softening into something that looked like concern but felt like distance. A few approached me one by one, offering the same carefully chosen phrases, their hands briefly touching mine before they moved on, already turning their attention elsewhere. It was not unkindness exactly. It was something quieter than that, something colder. It was the kind of politeness reserved for someone who no longer held a place in the center of things. Outside, the afternoon light stretched long across the parking lot, pale and indifferent. I stepped out slowly, the heels of my shoes clicking against the pavement, each sound too loud in the stillness. I noticed how Vanessa stood near the entrance, speaking with the funeral director, her posture confident, her tone measured. She held a folder in her hands, thick with papers, and for a moment I wondered when exactly she had taken control of something that should have belonged to me. When she saw me, she smiled again, that same practiced smile, and walked toward me as if we were sharing something mutual. "You did well today," she said gently, as though I had performed a role rather than lived through a loss. I inclined my head slightly, accepting the comment without responding. There are moments when words do not add anything. This was one of them. Daniel joined us a second later, adjusting his jacket, his eyes flicking briefly in my direction before settling somewhere just past my shoulder. "We have arranged for a small reception," he said, his voice even, businesslike. "Just close friends and family." Close friends and family. I almost asked him what that meant now, but I already knew the answer. It did not include me in the way it once had. The reception was held in a private room at a nearby restaurant, the kind Richard used to like for quiet dinners, the kind where the lighting is low and the conversations are meant to stay contained within the walls. I took a seat near the end of the table, noticing again how easily my place had been decided without my input. Plates were set, glasses filled, conversations resumed, but the tone had shifted. It was lighter now, almost relieved, as though the formal weight of the service had been lifted and replaced with something more practical. I listened as Vanessa spoke about arrangements, about paperwork, about the next steps, her words moving quickly, efficiently, each one building on the last. "There are a few things we will need to handle soon," she said, glancing briefly at Daniel before continuing. "The house, for example. It is quite large, and maintenance alone can become overwhelming." Her voice softened slightly at the end, as if she were offering concern. I looked at her, really looked this time, and saw not grief but calculation, not uncertainty but a quiet certainty that things would unfold exactly as she expected. Daniel nodded beside her, his expression thoughtful, but not conflicted. That was what struck me most. There was no hesitation, no pause, no sign that he questioned the direction she was guiding him toward. "We just want to make sure everything is manageable for you," he added, his tone careful, almost rehearsed. Manageable. The words settled between us, heavy with implication. I took a sip of water, letting the silence stretch just long enough to be noticed, but not long enough to invite confrontation. Around us, the others continued eating, talking, laughing softly at something someone said, the normal rhythm of life resuming as if nothing fundamental had shifted. But something had. I could feel it clearly now, like a line drawn quietly in the sand. On one side stood the life I had known, the one built over decades, steady and shared. On the other stood this new version, where decisions were made without me, where my role had been reduced to something smaller, something easier to overlook. Vanessa leaned slightly closer, her voice lowering just enough to feel private. "You will not have to worry about anything," she said. "We will take care of it." I met her gaze then, holding it for a moment longer than necessary, and in that brief exchange I understood everything I needed to know. They believed I needed taking care of. They believed I was already dependent, already diminished, already someone whose future could be arranged without question. I gave a small nod, a gesture so subtle it could have meant agreement. "I am sure you will," I said quietly. And I meant it, though not in the way she expected. Because as I sat there, listening to their plans unfold in careful, measured tones, I began to see the shape of what they were building, and more importantly, the assumptions holding it together. Assumptions about me. Assumptions about what I knew, what I had, what I was capable of. I let them speak. I let them believe. And I said nothing at all. I returned home just before sunset. The sky stretched in soft shades of gray and gold, the kind of quiet evening Richard used to appreciate after a long day. But the house did not feel the same when I stepped inside. The air was still, untouched, as if it had been waiting for someone who would never walk through that door again. I placed my purse carefully on the entry table and stood there for a moment longer than necessary, letting the silence settle around me, not resisting it, not trying to fill it. Silence, I had learned, reveals more than noise ever could. I moved slowly through the living room, my fingers brushing lightly against the back of the sofa, the polished wood of the bookshelf, the small framed photographs that had once felt like proof of a life well lived. Now they felt like evidence, pieces of something others had already begun to rewrite without me. I noticed the subtle changes immediately. A stack of papers had been moved from Richard's desk, no longer in the precise order he always kept. A drawer slightly open where it had always been closed. Small things. Easy to miss. But not to me. I closed the drawer gently, my movements deliberate, my thoughts already beginning to align. They had been here. Not to remember him. Not to grieve. To search. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, the familiar routine grounding me as I leaned lightly against the counter. I replayed the conversation from earlier, the careful way Vanessa had introduced the idea of managing things, the quiet agreement in Daniel's voice, the absence of any real question directed toward me. It had not been a discussion. It had been a decision, already made, waiting only for my quiet acceptance. I set the glass down and looked out the window, watching the last light fade across the yard Richard had spent years tending, every corner shaped by his patience, his attention to detail. He had never rushed anything. Not the garden. Not our life. Not the plans he made in the background. The ones he never spoke about openly, only hinted at in small, deliberate ways. Not everything needs to be visible to be secure, he had told me once, his voice calm, certain. At the time, I had not asked questions. I had trusted him. Now, standing there alone, I understood that trust had been placed carefully, not blindly. I turned and walked back toward his study, pausing at the doorway before stepping inside. The room felt different now, not because anything had changed dramatically, but because I was seeing it with new eyes. The desk, the filing cabinet, the locked drawer he had always kept the key for. I approached it slowly, my hand hovering just above the surface before I pulled it open. Empty. Not entirely, but enough to tell me what I needed to know. Whatever had been important was no longer there. I did not feel anger. That surprised me at first. What I felt instead was clarity. A quiet, steady awareness that things were unfolding exactly as they had been set in motion, just not by the people who believed they were in control. I closed the drawer again and stepped back, taking in the room as a whole, letting the details settle into place in my mind. Footsteps behind me would not have surprised me, but none came. They had already done what they came to do. Or at least, they believed they had. I moved toward the bookshelf and ran my fingers along the spines of the books Richard had collected over the years, each one chosen with intention, each one kept in perfect order. One book, slightly out of place, caught my attention. I paused, then adjusted it carefully, aligning it with the others. It was a small gesture, meaningless to anyone else. But to me, it was a reminder. Things only appear disordered when you do not understand the system behind them. I stepped back into the hallway, the house quiet around me, the weight of the day finally settling into something more solid, more defined. They thought they had already begun to reshape my life. They thought I would follow the path they had outlined, accept the version of events they were quietly constructing. I let that belief remain exactly where it was. Because belief, like silence, can be a very useful thing when left undisturbed. I turned off the lights one by one, moving through the house with steady, unhurried steps, and when I reached the bedroom, I paused at the doorway, looking at the space that had once been shared, now entirely mine. Not smaller, not emptier, just different. I stepped inside and closed the door gently behind me, knowing that whatever came next would not be decided for me. Not this time. The next morning arrived without ceremony, just a pale stretch of light slipping through the curtains and settling quietly across the bedroom floor. I had always believed mornings carried a certain kind of clarity, a way of separating what mattered from what did not. And as I sat at the edge of the bed, I found that belief still held true. I did not rush. I dressed slowly, choosing a simple sweater and a pair of slacks. Nothing that drew attention, nothing that suggested anything had shifted beyond what others already assumed. When I stepped into the kitchen, the house felt less like a place of memory and more like a space waiting to be understood again. I made coffee the way Richard used to like it, strong, steady, without unnecessary additions, and carried the mug into his study. I did not sit at his desk immediately. Instead, I stood there for a moment, looking at it from a distance, as if the angle might reveal something I had not seen before. It often does. People think answers are hidden in complexity, but most of the time they sit quietly in plain sight, waiting for someone patient enough to notice. I opened the cabinet beneath the bookshelf, the one that held documents no one ever paid attention to because they were too ordinary to matter. Home insurance, property taxes, maintenance records, things that suggested routine rather than significance. I flipped through them carefully, not searching for anything specific, just allowing my hands to move, my mind to follow. Richard had never been careless. That was the one certainty I held on to. Whatever mattered would not be left exposed, and whatever was exposed would not be what mattered. The realization did not come all at once. It never does. It unfolded slowly, like a pattern becoming visible only after you have looked at it long enough. The missing papers from the drawer were not the beginning. They were the result. Someone had come looking for something they believed would be obvious. Something labeled, something direct, something they could recognize without effort. But Richard did not build his life that way, and he certainly did not leave it behind that way. I set the papers aside and moved to the bookshelf again, this time more deliberately. Titles, authors, subjects, all arranged with a precision that had always seemed like habit, but now felt like intention. My fingers traced along the edges until I reached the book that had been slightly out of place the night before. I pulled it free, holding it in my hands for a moment before opening it. Inside, nothing appeared unusual at first. Just pages, clean and orderly, like everything else he owned. But when I turned to the center, I found it. Not a document, not a statement, not anything that would have satisfied someone looking for immediate answers. Just a small envelope, unmarked, placed carefully between the pages. I did not rush to open it. Instead, I sat down slowly, letting the moment settle into something steady. There is a difference between discovering something and understanding it. I wanted the latter. When I finally opened the envelope, the contents were simple. A card, a name, a number. No explanation, no instructions. Just enough to guide someone who knew how to follow without drawing attention to itself. I recognized the name immediately. Harrison, Richard's attorney. The one person he trusted with matters he never discussed openly. The one who had always operated quietly in the background, present but never intrusive. I placed the card on the desk and leaned back slightly, considering what it meant, not just in terms of information, but in terms of timing. Richard had not left this for anyone to find easily. He had left it for me. Not because I was the only one who could open a book, but because I was the only one who would understand why it was there in the first place. There was a difference between searching and noticing. They had searched. I had noticed. I stood up then, folding the card carefully and slipping it into my pocket, not as a secret, but as a continuation of something that had already been set in motion long before anyone else realized there was something to find. The house remained quiet as I moved through it again, but the silence had changed. It no longer felt empty. It felt deliberate, like a pause between decisions. I picked up my phone from the kitchen counter and held it for a moment, my thumb resting lightly against the screen before I entered the number from memory. It rang once, twice, then a voice, calm, familiar. Harrison, he said. I allowed myself a small breath before speaking, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition. Some conversations do not begin when you make the call. They begin long before that, in the quiet understanding that when the time comes, you will know exactly what to say. This is Margaret Collins. I replied, my voice steady, unchanged. I believe it is time we spoke. The meeting was set for the following morning, at an office downtown that I had only visited a handful of times over the years, always alongside Richard, always as an observer rather than a participant. The building itself had not changed, a quiet structure of glass and stone that reflected the city around it without drawing attention to itself. I arrived 10 minutes early, not because I was uncertain, but because I have always believed that time reveals intention, and I wanted a few moments to understand the space before stepping into whatever waited for me inside. The receptionist greeted me with a polite smile and asked for my name, and when I gave it, I noticed the slight shift in her expression, not recognition exactly, but something close to it, as if my presence fit into a context she had already been prepared for. "Mr. Harrison is expecting you," she said, her voice steady, and I nodded once before taking a seat. The waiting area was quiet, the kind of quiet that suggests important conversations happen behind closed doors, conversations that do not require raised voices to carry weight. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, observing the details the way I always do when something matters. The arrangement of chairs, the placement of the magazines, the way the clock on the wall ticked with precise, measured intervals. Nothing here was accidental. After a few minutes, the door to the inner office opened, and Mr. Harrison stepped out, his posture as composed as I remembered, his expression calm but attentive. "Mrs. Collins," he said, extending his hand, and there was something in his tone that confirmed what I had already begun to understand. This was not a meeting arranged out of courtesy. It was a continuation of something already in motion. I rose and took his hand briefly, then followed him into his office, closing the door behind me. The room was simple, functional, with a large desk, 2 chairs, and a window that overlooked the street below. He gestured for me to sit, and I did, placing my purse neatly at my side. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Silence again, but this time it felt different. Not empty. Expectant. "Richard planned carefully," he said at last, his voice even measured. I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the statement without interrupting. There was no need to rush him. People reveal more when they are allowed to move at their own pace. He was aware that circumstances can change quickly, Mr. Harrison continued, his hands resting lightly on the desk in front of him. And he wanted to ensure that certain protections were in place, regardless of how those changes might appear on the surface. I watched him as he spoke, noting the precision of his language, the way each word was chosen to convey exactly what was necessary and nothing more. It was a style I recognized. Richard had always valued clarity over excess. "The documents that were removed from your home," he added, pausing just briefly before continuing, "were not the documents that hold the full picture." I allowed a small breath to leave me, not in relief, but in confirmation. "I assumed as much," I said quietly. Mr. Harrison nodded once, as if that answer aligned with his expectations. He reached into a drawer and removed a folder, placing it on the desk between us without opening it immediately. "Your husband established a series of trusts over the past several years," he explained, his voice steady. "Each one structured in a way that limits visibility unless accessed through the proper channels." He slid the folder slightly closer to me, but his hand remained on top of it, holding it in place. "The total value of these assets, at the time of his passing, is approximately $28 million. The number did not shock me, not because it was small, but because of the way it had been presented, not as a revelation, but as a fact that had always existed, simply waiting for acknowledgement. I met his gaze, holding it for a moment before speaking. "And these trusts," I said, my tone calm, unchanged, "are they accessible?" He removed his hand from the folder then, allowing it to rest fully in front of me. "They are," he replied, "but only under your authorization. You are the sole beneficiary, and more importantly, the sole decision maker." I rested my fingers lightly on the edge of the folder, not opening it yet, not needing to see the documents to understand their significance. What mattered was not just what they contained, but what they represented. Control, not in the loud, visible sense that others often chase, but in the quiet, deliberate sense that shapes outcomes long before they become apparent. "Does anyone else know?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Mr. Harrison's expression remained unchanged. "No," he said simply, "and unless you choose to disclose it, they will not." I nodded once, letting the silence settle again, but this time it felt different. Not uncertain. Certain. I opened the folder then, not to search for confirmation, but to acknowledge what had already been placed in my hands. Pages, numbers, signatures, all arranged with the same precision I had come to expect. I closed it again just as calmly, placing my hand flat against the cover for a brief moment. "Thank you," I said, rising from my seat. Mr. Harrison stood as well, his posture unchanged, his expression steady. Richard trusted your judgment, he said, not as reassurance, but as a statement of fact. I met his gaze one last time, then picked up my purse and turned toward the door. As I stepped back into the hallway, the quiet of the office felt different than it had when I arrived. Not because anything had changed, but because I had. Outside, the city moved as it always did, unaware, indifferent, continuing its rhythm without pause. I walked to my car without rushing, my steps steady, my mind clear. They believed they understood the situation. They believed they had already begun to shape what came next. I let that belief remain exactly where it was, undisturbed, intact. Because sometimes the most powerful position is not the one that is seen, but the one that is assumed to be empty. I did not go home immediately after leaving the office. Instead, I drove slowly through streets I had known for years, watching the city move around me with its usual certainty, as if nothing had shifted, as if the quiet recalibration of my life existed entirely outside of its awareness. There is a particular kind of clarity that comes after understanding something fully, not just in pieces, not just in fragments, but as a whole, and I felt it settle into place as I stopped at a red light and rested my hands lightly on the steering wheel. They believed I was fragile. They believed I was dependent. They believed I would follow the path they had already begun to outline for me. I let those thoughts sit exactly where they belonged, untouched, unchallenged. When I finally returned to the house, the afternoon had deepened into early evening, the lights softer now, stretching long across the floors as I stepped inside. I placed my keys on the table and walked through each room with quiet purpose, not searching this time, not questioning, but observing with a different understanding. Nothing had changed physically since that morning, and yet everything felt altered, not because of what was missing, but because of what I now knew. I moved into the kitchen and prepared a simple dinner, something I had done thousands of times before, the rhythm familiar, steady, grounding. There is comfort in routine, but there is also strategy in it. Routine makes people predictable. Predictability makes them easy to read. I set the table for one and sat down, eating slowly, my thoughts moving not toward what had already happened, but toward what would come next. The conversation at the restaurant replayed in my mind, the careful way Vanessa had introduced the idea of change, the quiet agreement in Daniel's voice, the absence of hesitation that told me more than any direct statement could have. They were not waiting. They were preparing. That realization did not unsettle me. It clarified things. After dinner, I cleared the table and washed the dishes, placing each item back exactly where it belonged, the order of the kitchen restored with quiet precision. Then I dried my hands and walked into the living room, picking up my phone as I did. I did not rush to make the call. Timing matters, not just in what you say, but in when you say it. I waited until the house felt completely still, until the last traces of daylight had faded and the rooms had settled into their nighttime quiet. Then I selected Daniel's number and pressed call. He answered on the third ring. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying a note of surprise that he tried, unsuccessfully, to mask. I could hear movement in the background, the faint sound of something being set down, perhaps a glass, perhaps a phone. "I was going to call you," he added quickly. "Of course," I replied, my tone calm, unchanged. "I imagine you have quite a few things on your mind." There was a brief pause, just long enough to confirm that he understood the direction of the conversation, even if he was not entirely sure how to navigate it. "Vanessa and I were talking," he said carefully, "about the house, about making things easier for you." I walked slowly across the room as he spoke, my fingers trailing lightly along the back of the sofa, the same path I had taken the night before, but this time with a different purpose. "Easier," I repeated softly, letting the words settle between us. "Yes," he continued, his voice gaining a little confidence now that he had found his footing. "It is a lot to manage on your own. We thought it might be a good idea to start looking at options. Maybe something smaller, more manageable." I stopped walking and looked out the window, my reflection faint against the dark glass, steady, composed, exactly as I intended. "That sounds like a very thoughtful suggestion," I said, and I could almost hear the shift on the other end of the line, the subtle release of tension, the quiet assumption that agreement had been reached. "We just want what is best for you," he added, and this time his voice carried something closer to sincerity, though it was shaped by a perspective that no longer applied. "I understand," I replied, "and I think you are right. There are some things that need to be handled carefully. Another pause. Longer this time. Not uncertainty. Expectation. I would like to discuss it in person. I continued, my tone steady, measured. All of it. The house. The finances. The next steps. I chose my words deliberately, giving him exactly what he expected to hear. Nothing more, nothing less. That makes sense, he said, and I could hear the agreement settle into place. We can come by tomorrow evening. Tomorrow evening works, I replied. 7 o'clock. We ended the call shortly after, the conversation clean, uncomplicated, exactly as it needed to be. I set the phone down and remained where I was for a moment, looking at my reflection in the window, not searching for reassurance, not questioning what I had just done. Everything was moving as it should. They believed they were guiding the conversation. They believed they were leading the outcome. I allowed that belief to remain exactly where it was, because belief, when left unchallenged, has a way of revealing far more than any confrontation ever could. I turned off the light and stood in the darkness for a moment longer, the quiet of the house surrounding me, no longer empty, no longer uncertain, but aligned, as if every piece had settled into its proper place, waiting only for the moment it would be seen clearly by everyone involved. The next day unfolded with a kind of quiet precision that I had not felt in years, not rushed, not uncertain, but measured, as if every hour had already been placed exactly where it belonged. I woke early, not out of habit, but out of intention, and moved through the morning with steady, deliberate steps. Coffee brewed in the kitchen, the same way it always had, the same rich scent filling the air, grounding me in something familiar, while everything else shifted just beneath the surface. I did not change anything about the house. That was important. The furniture remained exactly where it had always been, the photographs undisturbed, the small details untouched. There is a kind of message in consistency, especially when others expect to find signs of weakness or confusion. By the time the clock moved past noon, I had already reviewed the documents Mr. Harrison had given me, not in a frantic search for answers, but in a calm, methodical way, understanding not just what was there, but how it was structured, how it was protected, and more importantly, how it would be revealed. I closed the folder and placed it neatly inside the desk drawer, not hidden, not exposed, simply where it belonged for now. The afternoon passed quietly. I read for a while, something I had not allowed myself to do in days, letting the words settle into my mind without distraction. Every so often, I glanced at the clock, not out of impatience, but to measure the approach of the moment that had already begun to take shape. At 6:30, I stood and walked through the house one more time, not inspecting, not correcting, but observing. The living room was prepared without looking prepared. The lighting soft, the space open, nothing staged, nothing forced. I set 3 glasses on the table, not because I expected a long conversation, but because details matter and people notice more than they realize. At exactly 7 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I did not rush to answer it. I waited a few seconds, enough to establish a rhythm that was mine, not theirs, and then I walked to the door and opened it. Daniel stood there, his posture straight, his expression composed, but his eyes carried a trace of something else, something I had not seen the day before. Anticipation. Vanessa stood beside him, her smile already in place, polished, controlled, her gaze moving quickly past me into the house, as if assessing the space before stepping inside. "Mom," Daniel said, offering a brief nod as he entered, and Vanessa followed, her presence filling the room in a way that felt intentional rather than natural. "Thank you for having us," she added, her tone smooth, practiced. I closed the door behind them and gestured toward the living room. "Of course," I said simply. "Please sit." They took their seats without hesitation, Daniel choosing the chair closest to the table, Vanessa positioning herself beside him, her posture angled slightly forward, ready, engaged. I remained standing for a moment longer, then moved to my chair and sat down, folding my hands lightly in my lap. No one spoke immediately. Silence again, but this time it was different. Not empty. Tense. Waiting. Vanessa was the first to break it. "We have been thinking about what we discussed," she began. Her voice measured, her eyes focused directly on me. "About making things easier moving forward." I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without encouraging it. Daniel leaned slightly forward, his hands clasped together. "We did some research," he added. There are some very nice places nearby. Smaller homes, easier to maintain, closer to everything you might need. I listened without interrupting, letting their words unfold fully, giving them the space to present exactly what they had prepared. Vanessa continued, her tone softening slightly, as if to emphasize care. And we thought it might be best to start the process sooner rather than later. The market is in a good place right now, and the house could sell quickly. There it was. Not a suggestion. A plan. Carefully framed, carefully delivered, but unmistakable in its intent. I let a small pause settle between us, just long enough to shift the weight of the room, and then I spoke. That sounds very efficient, I said, my voice calm, steady, offering nothing that could be interpreted as resistance. I watched as a subtle change passed between them. A glance, a shared understanding that their approach was working, that the conversation was moving exactly where they expected it to go. We just want to make sure everything is handled properly, Daniel said, his voice more assured now, the uncertainty from the day before replaced with something closer to confidence. Of course, I replied. And I agree. Things should be handled properly. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my gaze steady, my expression unchanged. That is why I have already begun taking care of the financial side of things. The words were simple, direct, unremarkable on the surface. But I saw it immediately, the way Vanessa's expression shifted, just slightly, the way Daniel's hands tightened together for a fraction of a second before he relaxed them again. Not alarm. Not yet. Just the first small crack in the assumption they had been holding onto so carefully. I let the silence follow, not filling it, not explaining, allowing the weight of that single statement to settle exactly where it needed to. Because sometimes, the most effective way to change a conversation is not to interrupt it, but to let it continue under a different set of expectations, ones that have not yet been fully understood by the people speaking. The silence that followed my words did not break immediately, and that was exactly as it should be. Vanessa was the first to move, though only slightly, her posture straightening as her eyes narrowed just enough to signal recalculation. Daniel shifted in his seat, his confidence no longer as steady as it had been moments before, his gaze searching my face as if trying to find something he had missed. You have already started? He asked, his tone careful, measured, no longer leading but adjusting. I nodded once, not elaborating, not rushing to explain what did not need immediate clarification. Yes, I said simply. It seemed appropriate. Vanessa leaned forward then, her hands resting lightly on her knees, her expression composed but more focused now, the smooth certainty from earlier replaced with something sharper, more attentive. That is good, she said, choosing her words with precision. What exactly have you arranged? There it was. Not concern, not support, information. I let a small pause settle again, not to create tension, but to allow the question to exist fully before answering it. I have reviewed the financial structure, I replied, my voice calm, steady, giving them exactly enough to understand that the situation was not as simple as they had assumed. Daniel glanced briefly at Vanessa, then back at me, his brows drawing together just slightly. Financial structure? He repeated, as if testing the phrase, trying to determine what it implied. I met his gaze evenly. Your father was very thorough, I said. He made certain decisions long before this week. Vanessa's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly against the fabric of her dress, a small detail, easy to miss unless you were looking for it. I was. We are aware there were accounts, she said, her voice still controlled, but now carrying a different edge, one that suggested she was no longer entirely certain of the ground she was standing on. That is why we wanted to help organize everything. I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the statement without confirming it. Of course, I replied. Organization is important. The room felt smaller now, not physically, but in the way attention had narrowed, every word carrying more weight than before. Daniel leaned back slightly, his hands unclasping, then coming together again, a subtle sign of discomfort he had not yet learned to hide. Mom, he said, his tone shifting, softer now, more cautious. If there is something we should know, it would be helpful for us to be on the same page. I let the words settle, not dismissing them, but not accepting the premise behind them either. We are on the same page, I said quietly. You are concerned about what comes next. So am I. Vanessa's gaze sharpened further, her smile no longer present, replaced with a focused stillness that revealed more than any expression could. Then perhaps we should review everything together, she suggested, her voice steady but no longer light. So there are no misunderstandings. I watched her for a moment, considering not just the request, but the intention behind it. Control is often disguised as clarity. I had seen that before. That will not be necessary, I said, my tone unchanged, not firm in a way that invited conflict, but final in a way that did not leave room for negotiation. The shift was immediate. Not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable. Daniel's shoulders tensed slightly, his gaze dropping for a brief moment before returning to mine. Vanessa remained still, her posture composed, but the ease she had carried into the room was gone. Not necessary, she repeated, her voice quieter now, more contained. I shook my head once, a small, deliberate movement. Everything is already structured appropriately, I said. There is nothing unclear. The words settled into the space between us, changing it in a way that could not be reversed. They had come expecting to guide, to advise, to shape what would happen next. Now they were listening, adjusting, recalculating in real time. I could see it in the way Daniel's eyes moved, in the way Vanessa's breathing slowed, controlled, as she processed what had not yet been said but was already understood. I see, Daniel said after a moment, though it was clear that he did not entirely. I leaned forward slightly then, just enough to shift the dynamic without raising my voice, without altering my tone. There are a few formalities that will need to be completed, I continued. Legal matters. Financial confirmations. I have already begun that process. Vanessa's lips pressed together briefly, then relaxed, her composure returning in a more deliberate form, one that required effort rather than coming naturally. Of course, she said. We just want to make sure you are not overwhelmed. I allowed myself the smallest pause before responding. I am not overwhelmed, I said. And, for the first time, there was no softness in the statement, no space for it to be interpreted as anything other than what it was. The room grew still again, but this time the silence carried a different weight. Not expectation, not uncertainty, recognition. They were beginning to understand that the version of me they had been speaking to no longer existed in the way they had assumed. And more importantly, that it may never have existed at all. The silence that followed did not feel uncertain anymore. It felt complete. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, his confidence no longer returning the way it had before, as if something fundamental had slipped just out of his reach, and he could not quite grasp it again. Vanessa, however, remained still, her posture controlled, her expression composed in a way that suggested she was no longer trying to guide the conversation, but trying to understand it. That, more than anything, told me the moment had arrived. I reached calmly beside me and picked up the folder I had placed earlier, resting it lightly on the table between us without opening it right away. The movement was small, deliberate, enough to draw their attention without forcing it. Both of them looked at it immediately, not out of curiosity, out of recognition that something they had not accounted for was about to be made visible. There is one thing we should clarify, I said, my voice steady, unchanged, not raised, not sharpened, simply precise. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on the folder now, while Vanessa's gaze moved from it to me, searching, calculating, adjusting. I opened the folder slowly, not to create suspense, but to allow the moment to unfold at its own pace, the way truth often does when it no longer needs to be hidden. Papers rested neatly inside, organized, structured, clear. I did not hand them over. I did not need to. Your father did not leave things unfinished. I continued, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of the documents. He planned very carefully. Daniel swallowed, a small movement, but one that carried more weight than anything he had said that evening. We understand that, he replied, though his voice had lost the certainty it once carried. I met his gaze, holding it just long enough to let him feel the difference between what he thought he understood and what was actually in front of him. No, I said quietly. You understand part of it. Vanessa spoke then, her tone controlled but no longer smooth. Then perhaps you should explain the rest. There was no challenge in her voice now, only focus. I nodded once, acknowledging the request without rushing to fill it. The financial structure your father created, I said, does not operate the way you believe it does. I turned one of the documents slightly, just enough for them to see the heading, the formal language, the signatures that carried weight far beyond appearance. I did not need them to read every word. They only needed to recognize what it was. These are trust agreements, I continued, established over several years, structured privately, legally protected. Daniel's eyes moved across the page, his expression tightening as understanding began to form, not all at once, but piece by piece, like something falling into place too late to be stopped. And these trusts, Vanessa said slowly, her voice quieter now, more controlled. Who exactly are they for? I allowed a brief pause, not for effect, but because the answer did not require urgency. They are mine, I said. The words were simple, direct, final. The room shifted in a way that could not be undone. Daniel leaned back slightly, his hands falling apart in his lap, his posture no longer composed but unsettled. Vanessa did not move, but the stillness she held now was different. Not controlled. Contained. All of them? Daniel asked, his voice lower, almost careful. I nodded once. All of them. Silence followed, but this time it was not the kind that invites more words. It was the kind that forces them to stop. I closed the folder gently and rested my hand on top of it. Not protectively, not defensively, simply as acknowledgement. Approximately $28 million, I added, not as a statement of power, but as a fact that no longer needed to remain unspoken. The number settled into the room with a weight that did not require emphasis. Vanessa's composure shifted then, just slightly, her shoulders tightening before she relaxed them again, her gaze no longer searching, no longer calculating, but fixed, as if she were reassessing everything that had led to this moment. Daniel looked at me differently now, not with avoidance, not with assumption, but with something closer to realization. You never mentioned any of this, he said. I held his gaze steadily. No, I replied. I did not. Another pause, longer this time. Not because there was more to say, but because what had been said was enough. Vanessa inhaled slowly, then spoke, her voice careful, measured in a way it had not been before. That changes things, she said. I tilted my head slightly, considering her words before responding. It does, I said, but not in the way you think. I let that settle, not expanding on it, not explaining further, because the truth did not need to be explained anymore. It was visible now, clear in a way that could not be redirected or reinterpreted. I stood then, not abruptly, not as an ending, but as a transition. The house will remain as it is, I said calmly, and the rest will be handled accordingly. There was no resistance this time, no immediate reply, only silence, and within it, understanding. I walked them to the door with the same steady composure I had carried throughout the evening, opening it without hesitation. Daniel stepped out first, slower than before, his movements no longer certain. Vanessa followed, pausing just briefly at the threshold, as if she wanted to say something more, but could not find the words to shape it. I met her gaze for a moment, not with anger, not with triumph, but with clarity. Then I closed the door gently behind them. The house was quiet again, but it was no longer the same kind of quiet. It was not empty. It was not waiting. It was settled. Everything that needed to be understood had been placed exactly where it belonged. And for the first time since the funeral, there was nothing left that needed to remain unspoken.